In 2020, in the Indian city of Hathras, a 19-year-old girl went to a farm to collect cattle feed. On her way, she encountered 4 men. They started talking, socialized a bit, and then suddenly attacked her, knocked her down, and raped her. Later, her mother found her, paralyzed and barely alive. For 2 weeks, doctors fought to save her, while the police dealt with her outraged relatives. After she passed away, her body was secretly cremated by police without informing her family. Due to public pressure, the suspects were put on trial, but 3 of the 4 attackers were fully acquitted. The fact is, the victim belonged to the untouchable caste, while her attackers were from higher castes. India is a land of paradoxes. In recent years, it became the most populous country, surpassing China. It joined the world's largest economies, overtaking Britain, France, and Russia. Millions of tourists visit Goa to seek spiritual enlightenment, yet at the same time, hundreds of millions of Indians suffer humiliation, beatings, and even killings simply because they were born into the wrong family. Fear for their lives isn't the only challenge these people face. They struggle to find jobs and access education. Poverty in India is often inherited, turning ordinary people into outcasts. 1 in 5 people globally is born, lives, and dies within the confines of a caste system that dictates their life. This system assigns who is better or worse, who is clean or impure. It decides how one should live, work, whom to marry, and even what to eat. Today, we're examining whether it's possible to change castes, how India resembles a prison, why India isn't a place for love, and how Britain imposed a racial hierarchy in India. By the end, we'll understand if Indians themselves want this to change. This video, as you can tell, is about castes. But what exactly is it? No one can provide a complete answer, not professional Indologists nor Indians themselves. The caste system is a multifaceted social phenomenon that has evolved significantly. At its core, castes are social groups that Indian society consists of, and today there are no fewer than 3,000 castes in the country. Each Indian is born into a specific caste, inheriting their parents' status. A person's caste often shows up in their last name. For example, the last name Gandhi is common among members of the merchant caste. Each caste is traditionally tied to a profession. The ancestors of some worked in politics, others herded livestock, some cleaned streets, while others engaged in academia. Like caste, professions are inherited. Castes have unequal statuses. If you were born into the priest or scholar caste, you could say there's no one above you. You're likely wealthier and more educated than most citizens, with a greater chance of holding a high government position. A key aspect of the caste system is that one can only marry within their caste. Inter-caste marriages happen, but they often end in personal tragedy. And finally, there's diet. Higher castes tend to follow vegetarian or vegan diets as an ideal in Hindu cuisine. In higher castes, dietary restrictions aren't always strict, especially in places like Goa, where many eat meat despite Hindu norms. Different people interpret vegetarianism in various ways. Some avoid all animal products, while others avoid only beef. Both Hinduism and Buddhism discourage killing and harming any living being. Yet India is known worldwide less for strict religious norms and more for its chicken curry. Members of different castes might work in the same industry but at different levels. For example, lower castes dye fabric, middle castes sew clothes, and higher castes create the designs. In one of India's top universities, nearly half the places are reserved for those from disadvantaged castes, yet, even with this advantage, moving up remains nearly impossible. Indian society is stratified, and a person's path in life is predetermined, from birth to death. All these thousands of castes are loosely grouped into 4 main social classes. In Hindu mythology, each of these classes traces back to the creator god Brahma. The Brahmins, spiritual leaders, and the highest class, came from his head and mouth, the Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, from his arms, the Vaishyas, merchants and artisans, from his thighs, and the Shudras, laborers, from his feet. At the very bottom of the caste system are the untouchables. They traditionally performed the dirtiest work, handling waste, animal carcasses, and human corpses. These jobs were considered polluting, which led to untouchables being despised and restricted in their rights. The mere thought of touching an untouchable would drive members of higher castes to cleanse themselves. The core of the caste system is the perpetuation of social inequality. Imagine you're born with a certain status and role in society, like a cog in a car engine. You have a specific function to fulfill, and you're forbidden from deviating from these prescribed roles. To maintain this inequality, marriage is only permitted within the caste, and children's futures are mapped out far in advance. However, it wasn't always this way. The history of castes can be divided into two stages, before and after British colonization. Before the British arrived, castes were a more flexible system, and the hierarchy wasn't as strict. 3,000 years ago, the Aryans came to ancient India from the territories of present-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. They imposed their culture, language, and religion on ancient India. To better control the lands they conquered, they divided themselves into three groups: clergy, warriors, and artisans. Later, after they subdued the native population, four main classes emerged: clergy, warriors, merchants, and laborers. This served as a precursor to the caste system. The ancient text Manusmriti is said to have formalized caste hierarchy, stating that the sole calling of Shudras is to serve others. This subordination was justified by a practical logic. Shudras, or workers, didn't need knowledge or talent, just their working hands. At birth, caste status was believed to be determined by karma, merits accumulated in past lives. If you acted immorally, you were assigned a lower status. If you followed the norms, you could be welcomed into the higher castes. In this system, people were forbidden from breaking free from their caste, but adherence to the rules ensured a rebirth into a higher caste in the next life. As Indian society became more complex, the caste system evolved. Jatis, or occupational groups, emerged, where people with common professions were grouped together. Unlike Varnas, Jatis grew into thousands, with each group leading a more autonomous life. For example, if you were a shepherd, you would live among other shepherds and interact mainly with them. Social segregation was an inherent part of the caste system. Higher castes lived in the center of villages, while untouchables and lower castes were on the periphery. They were forbidden from using common wells or entering the homes of higher castes. However, despite these restrictions, the system remained somewhat dynamic. Many Indians found ways to circumvent caste laws, inventing new last names, backstories, and securing higher social positions. Over time, this changed. The British introduced a rigid caste classification, which solidified social inequality and limited social mobility. When the British arrived, everything changed. God in the sacred texts was replaced by bureaucracy, money, and racism. After the fall of the Mughal Empire and subsequent unrest, Indians began clumping into castes, seeking security and self-organization. The first to exploit this was Queen Victoria, who became Empress of India in 1876. The British fully colonized the country, marking a turning point for India. In the mid-19th century, India revolted against the East India Company, which controlled the nation. The primary cause of the rebellion was local dissatisfaction. In 1857, a mutiny broke out over the British use of rifle cartridges greased with beef and pork fat, which was intolerable for Hindus and Muslims. The revolt escalated into a civil war, now known as India's First War of Independence. It took 6 months to suppress, resulting in the deaths of 6,000 Britons and 800,000 Indians. Afterward, Britain realized things couldn't continue this way. The East India Company was dissolved, and India formally came under the Crown's jurisdiction. The British government announced a policy of religious tolerance and allowed Indians into government service for the first time. However, they began selecting candidates based on caste and included questions about caste in the census. Until the 19th century, castes were relatively flexible, and differences between them were minor. Britain changed this by enumerating castes and arranging them in a strict hierarchy. The British understood that governing a colony required local support, so they selected certain castes as favorites, entrusting them with power. At the top were castes associating themselves with Brahmins and Kshatriyas, deemed capable of governing, who were rewarded with high positions and privileges in exchange for loyalty. Lower castes were denied access to power. The most they were allowed was military service, while some groups were deemed unreliable and prone to rebellion. The British used various tools to divide society into better and worse. In censuses, citizens had to indicate their religion and race. To classify Indians into groups, the British measured their height and skull size. At the time, scientific racism was popular in Europe, which influenced British caste policies. Divide and conquer became the British motto. The British wondered whether criminal tendencies could be hereditary if professions in India were inherited. In 1871, they enacted the Criminal Tribes Act. James Stephen, a co-author of the law, explained it like this: if a tribe's ancestors were criminals from time immemorial, crime was predestined for their descendants. In his view, these tribes needed to be either eliminated or held accountable. British officials explicitly stated that all unfit Indians should either be killed or imprisoned. Criminal tribes included Indian groups called Adivasis, indigenous people who lived separately, spoke rare languages, and did not practice Hinduism. Certain warlike tribes engaged in brutal practices, such as beheading, which Britain sought to suppress. However, there were also peaceful groups that simply chose not to assimilate into Hindu society and continued to live in tribes. To combat crime, the British spared no expense. Police detained anyone, including children, sending them to correctional camps. The British often failed to understand the nuances and arrested not only criminals but also many untouchables and peasants, considering them dangerous. Britain's economic policies further deepened caste divides. Large numbers of Indian peasants lost their lands, which were transferred to higher castes and businesses. Untouchables had no land to lose, but many lower castes were stripped of everything they had. Indians were forced to sell land at rock-bottom prices, and eventually, the wealthiest 10% of Indians owned 80% of the agricultural land. There's a belief that the British rewrote Hindu texts, such as the Manusmriti, to entrench caste hierarchy. Many Indians believed that these texts originally lacked ideas on caste hierarchy and that Britain added these. Between 1876 and 1878, a severe famine occurred, killing between 12 and 30 million Indians. When Britain finally paid attention, it established labor camps where the impoverished were paid in food. Over the centuries, the British extracted approximately $45 trillion from India, based on Britain's 2022 GDP, and many Indian artifacts, including the famous Kohinoor diamond, ended up in Britain. Despite the harsh colonial exploitation, British presence did contribute to India's development. Railroads, modern education, early industrialization, and political institutions were introduced. The British claimed to address the oppression of untouchables, but they did so by placing Brahmins in power while excluding untouchables from decision-making. Brahmins were reluctant to share power, and untouchables continued to suffer. In the 20th century, it became clear that India needed change. After years of social and political challenges, a national liberation movement emerged. Two major figures rose in the struggle for independence: Mahatma Gandhi and Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. Gandhi came from a merchant caste, his mother was devout, and his father served as a chief minister in one of India's states. Gandhi's mother instilled in him lifelong values, and he adhered to rituals and dietary practices even while abroad. Bhimrao Ambedkar came from an untouchable background. As a child, he was isolated from higher caste children and couldn't even drink water from a shared vessel at school. Ambedkar studied day and night and became the first in his caste to graduate from college, though he was unhappy with his position in society. He later received a scholarship to study in the U.S., earning a doctorate in economics, a rare achievement for someone from his background. Gandhi and Ambedkar, despite their different origins, met in London, where both were studying law. After returning to India, they both faced discrimination. Gandhi experienced racism firsthand while working as a lawyer in South Africa. He was beaten for refusing to sit on the floor and for remaining in first class on a train. This experience transformed him from a lawyer into a freedom fighter and political leader. Ambedkar, after studying in Europe, was shocked to return to the rigid caste society. Seeing his family's oppression and knowing his children faced the same fate, he began fighting for the rights of the untouchables and founded an organization representing their interests. However, Gandhi opposed dismantling the caste system and criticized Ambedkar's protests. Their biggest conflict erupted when Ambedkar proposed increasing parliamentary seats for the lower castes. Gandhi feared this would further divide society and went on a hunger strike in protest, demanding the proposal's withdrawal. The British eventually compromised, knowing that Gandhi's death could trigger mass unrest. Each leader's efforts succeeded in different ways. Gandhi and his allies achieved India's independence, helping Indians realize their country was not merely a colony but a sovereign nation. The mass movement led by Gandhi resulted in India's freedom. Regarding the caste system, Gandhi seemingly opposed its destruction. While he was troubled by the stark inequalities and the plight of the untouchables, he valued the social order of Varnas. He even forbade his son from marrying outside their caste, but later admitted this was a mistake. Ambedkar, on the other hand, sought to eliminate the caste system. He believed that ending caste divisions was the only way to address the untouchable problem. To protest, he publicly burned the Manusmriti, a text that justified caste inequality. When he realized that he couldn't fully dismantle the system, he embraced Buddhism and devoted himself to his work. In 1947, Ambedkar was appointed to head the committee that would draft the Constitution of Independent India, where he declared caste-based inequality abolished. He secured certain rights for the untouchables, paving the way for political and social change. The lower castes were now to be recognized legally, but breaking societal prejudices proved difficult. In rural areas, untouchables still struggled with access to clean water and faced ongoing humiliation. Over time, the untouchables began calling themselves Dalits, meaning broken or scattered. Quotas were set up to ensure Dalit representation in government and parliament, providing some social support. However, Indian society's attitudes were slow to change. In 2022, nearly 60,000 crimes were committed against Dalits. In the 1990s, this number was 10 times lower, but it has grown with the population. In India, 13 Dalits are killed each week, 6 are abducted, and 5 have their homes burned down. Often, the justice system overlooks these crimes, leaving many of them unpunished. One of the most disturbing cases of violence against Dalits occurred in a village in western India, where 3 members of an untouchable family were brutally murdered. Their dismembered bodies were found in an empty well nearby. Suspicion immediately fell on members of the higher castes, but despite the obvious evidence, 10 years passed without any charges. The only arrest was the family member who reported the incident. In another case, a viral video exposed a police officer bragging about torturing Dalits and filing false cases against them. Although an investigation began, the officer was merely transferred to a different department. A year later, she was promoted to a senior position, and the case was closed. In 2014, shocking news hit India. A police inspector shot his colleague simply because the latter, a Dalit, dared to sit in the front seat of a car. This attitude also reflects the caste system's impact on marriage. While India doesn't officially prohibit intercaste marriages, in reality, these unions face severe obstacles and often end tragically. 7 years ago, a young Dalit man in Telangana wanted to marry a girl from a higher caste. Both families strongly opposed the relationship, leading the girl to attempt suicide in despair. When the young man left home to check on her, he was found beaten to death near a river the next day. Despite clear signs of assault, the police declared it a suicide and closed the case. This incident was labeled an honor killing. Typically, family members resort to such measures when they feel a bride has brought shame or dishonor upon them. The deceased man's partner refused to testify against her family. And while he suffered greatly, women often endure even harsher consequences. About 63% of crimes against Dalits are sexual in nature. In 2016, a Dalit girl called her father to report that her school coach had assaulted her. Though the assailant's identity was immediately known, finding justice proved nearly impossible. Over time, India's caste situation has not improved. In fact, it's worsened. Lower classes find it increasingly hard to break free from the system. The high birth rates in these communities further increase poverty levels and limit opportunities. Humiliation and violent retribution against lower castes continue, fueled by wealthy and elite Indians who are reluctant to relinquish their power. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. See you in our next video.